Hello everyone, welcome to another video in this full stack Flutter development series. We continue to look at our food ordering backend, and in this video I want to do some refactors mainly to our sign-in use case. As it stands, our sign-in use case can only sign in users who are signing via the email auth type. So if they signed up using email, then they can sign in with their email and password. But for those who are using OAuth services like Google, that would generally send over a bunch of information and password wouldn't be a part of it. So we need to find a way to sign in both email persons as well as those using OAuth services. And so I want to quickly refactor our sign-in use case to support both of those sign-in types. So I'm going to create two private methods. One, I'm going to say email login, and this one will take in the email and the password. So this is our email, and then another method that I'm going to call OAuth login that accepts a name, email, and a type. No password, since we need no password when we are logging in using or signing in using OAuth types. So for email, what we're gonna do is we're gonna say use the repository to find the email, pass in the email and catch the return error if the user doesn't exist, and set it to null. Now I'm going to say if the user doesn't exist, or if the user exists but the password is not the same. So in this case, I'm going to say password service and compare the password sent in from the user along with the password from the user that is fetched from the database. So if that is not true, then I'll reject the promise. I'll send a rejection to say invalid email or password. And if a user was found and the password is correct, then I'll just return the user ID. So that's it for my email login. For our OAuth login, gonna copy paste, find the user still. I'm going to say if the user exists and the user type three equal signs, if the user type is email. So what I'm doing here, I'm checking if this, since I'm finding email first, I'm checking if this email exists, but the user created an account using the email type, authentication type. So if the user is now trying to sign in using say for example Google, but they already created an account with this particular email address, then I'm going to reject that sign-in attempt, and I'm going to give a message to say account already exists, and say login with password. So since you create the account already with your password, log in with the password instead of OAuth. So if that's not the case and the user exists, so the user exists in the database, the email exists and is an OAuth user, then I'll just return the user ID because this user exists and everything is checking out correctly. Otherwise, if the user didn't exist but they are trying to sign in with OAuth for the first time, what I want to do is to add this user to the database. I'm going to say add, and I'm going to add the user name, email, and type. And after I've added that, then I'll return the user ID here of the newly created user. But as you can see, our add method expects 4 arguments and we're passing in 3. So we need to refactor our add method to make password optional, and optional must be the last thing. So create our password and we make it optional. So now we need to go into our auth repository, data, repository, auth repository, and inside of our add method we're gonna make this optional. Again, optionals has to be the last in the set of parameters. And since we're making that optional, we also need to configure our user schema for MongoDB so that it knows that there are times when a password will be present and there are times when a password will not be present. So in some cases, a document will be written without password, and in other cases, the document will be written with a password. So to accomplish this, we have to first modify our user model. So inside of our user model, here we have to say, listen, the password is optional. And inside the Mongo schema, all fields are optional unless you specifically explicitly add it as required. So as it stands right now, password is optional, name is optional as it stands. So back to our repository now. Inside of our add method, I am going to say, instead of using the create user model here, I'm going to say new user model. New user model. And I'm not going to add the password to it. Say new user model. And then here I'm going to say if the password is present, so if password hash, then saved user password equal password hash. Then I'll execute the save method to save it to the database. So now we have our password being optional when adding to our Mongo database. Now for our find method, we find by email. This is saying password is optional. So now I'm going to say if the password is not present, then create the user with a blank password, with an empty password, right? And also another thing is that with Mongo, there is no how should I put it? There is no type sensitivity. So in the case of an email, if you have a user who adds an email in all caps, and then somebody comes and trying to add a email in lowercase, then it will add the same email, because one is in all caps, one is in lowercase, because it's not type checking the case. So to alleviate that, I am just going to convert the email to lowercase when I'm checking for it, and when I'm adding it to the database, I'm also going to convert it to lowercase. To local lowercase. To lowercase. So now I have refactored that so I can add my user. So back to the sign in use case. Now that we have that, all that we need to do now is to say here, inside of execute, I need to pass in name, email, password, type. And then here I'm going to say if type equal email, then I'm going to return email login, and I'm going to pass in the email and the password. Otherwise, return auth login, passing in the name, the email, and the type. There we have refactored or sign in use case. So now inside of our controller, we need to fix that up. So entry point controller. Now we have this screaming out. Fix this. It will basically accept the same thing as sign up. I'll copy and paste that. Then I'll pass in, expecting 4 arguments. So pass in the name, the email, password, name, email, password, and the auth type. So now that we have all of those inside of our controller, now we need to set up our validation. So we are going to go back to our helpers validators, and I'm going to create some validators for my sign in. So for my sign in rules, I want the name to be not empty, but the name must not be empty if the auth type not equal to emails. So if the auth type is not email, then a name is required. We have our email validation, we have our auth type validation, and we have our password validation, which is the same as the one before. So a password should be present if the auth type equals email. So that's our validation. So now inside of our router, we say call our sign in validation rules, then validate. So we need to export. Sign in validation rule, export that. Export that. Sign in validation rules. Express request. Express response. There we have our routers configured with rules. Let us check our auth repository spec, see if there's no error. So type must come before password, since password is optional here. That is okay. Everything seems good. Alright, there. The auth spec. So now I want to configure my application and set up my Express server so that everything can be run as a whole and we can have access to those endpoints within our Flutter application. So I'm just going to close all these folders. I am going to, inside of source, I am going to create my app.ts file. And inside my app.ts file, this is where I'm going to configure my Express server. So I'll import Express from Express. I'll also use .env to configure my local env variables. .env. The first thing is call .env config. Then instantiate Express app. Then use Express JSON for JSON body app use express URL encoded extended true. This is basically the same setup as we have in our auth test or auth spec. And then I have to set up my routes. So for my auth route, I'm going to say, I'm going to create a file known as the composition root that will configure all the dependencies so that I can keep this main app.ts file slim. And then I'm going to start the server by saying listen app listen port listen on port 3000. I'm going to get the port from my env variable, so process env port, or what I can do is set it up as a constant here, port equal process env port. So now I add my port here and add a callback to say, going to just log to the console that I am listening on port. For this, I'm going to use my template string. Listening on port, whatever port. So now to create my composition root file where I configure my dependencies. Again, on the source, I'm going to say composition root ts, and I'm going to make this a singleton or a static class. Composition root Here I'll set up all my dependencies. So I configure my Mongoose client, import Mongoose from Mongoose. Then I'll have a method public static configure. This method will configure all the dependencies inside of my composition root. So now I'm going to say client equal new mongoose client, set up the connection string, connection str equal encode URI, get that from my process env variable, my test DB. I'm gonna continue using my test DB for now. Then client connect using the connection string along with the options. Use new URL parser true. Also use unified topology true. So I have configured my database. Now I'm going to create another method, static method, that will in a sense set up my auth router and its dependencies. So for my auth router, I want a repository, which is the auth repository, passing in the mongoose or mongoose client. I also want the token service, which is the JWT token service, and I'm going to pass in the private key from my environmental variable. Need password service also, equal new bcrypt password service. Then I can return my auth router, say configure with these dependencies. So repository, token service, and password service. So there I have my auth router configuration set up in my composition root. So now inside of my app, I just need to import this, and that's it. Now I have my auth router configured. My app TS file is slim and everything. All my object graph and the composing of objects reside in the composition root. So now to run this server, first I need to add port to the environmental variable and also the private key. So inside the environmental variable, I am going to say private key equal com food app. And then port equal 3000. So add those two. Add those two. And then now we can, inside of our package.json file, we can configure a script to execute our server. We call it dev, and we're gonna use TS node so that we don't have to compile to JavaScript. But if we're gonna deploy to a production server, we'll have to compile to JavaScript. So I'm just gonna use TS node. I'm gonna say app.ts. So now if I say npm run dev, that should start the server. So the server is started and listening on port 3000. So now we can try and create some users or try sign in using Postman. So now that my server is running here in Postman, I'm going to try and sign up a user with Google, and as you can see, no password is present since I'm using Google. So the path is localhost 3000 auth sign up. So if I send that, I receive an error that says password is required. So therefore there is an issue with my validation check for non-email. So let us go and fix that. So here we are again in VS Code. I think the issue might be how we execute. So I think the if check should come before the not empty. So if auth type is equal email, then it should not be empty. So let us try that. Just stop the server, start the server again. Alright, so in Postman, let us try again. Run. This error seems to be in relation to the password service. So let us look at that. So the issue has to do with our password service and hashing, trying to hash a password that is non-existent. So what we need to do is to first check if the password exists before we hash it. If it doesn't exist, then we pass in, then we pass in undefined or something like that. So I'm going to say if password exists, then let password hash if password exists, then password hash equals else password hash equal undefined. Then here I'll add password hash. So let us kill our server, start our server again. Just open Postman. Let us try it again. Different error. So here's the error. The issue is due to the fact that my Mongo client is null currently. I'm currently passing null because I have not called the configured method inside my app.ts. So I need to call the composition root configure method so it can set up my Mongo client and it will no longer be null. So let us try that again. We need to start the server first. Start our server. Now we try again. And there we have it. Now we have our user created and our token is now there. So let us look inside of our database to see if our user is created. So here inside of my Mongo Cloud Atlas database, if I scroll to the bottom, there I see I have the user here. And as you can see, there is no password field as opposed to the user above that has a password field. So we know that the user is being created. So let us again try and sign in with the same user using the same credentials. So I'm going to change it from sign up now to sign in and see what happens. And I believe it's the same validation issue again, where the if statement should come before the not empty. So let us quickly fix that. So for our password, the if statement should come before the not empty. So that should fix it. So we try again to sign in with the user just created. Oh, once we say we have to close the server and reopen. Once we made a change, we have to exit the server and start it again. Close the server. Start the server again. Let us try again. And there we have it. Successfully signed in with the user that we just created, and we have received an authentication token that we'll use in our application to access those features of the app that requires authentication. So thank you once again, guys, for checking out this video. I hope you are enjoying this series so far. Again, the code is on GitHub, and see you in the next one.